Good evening. Tonight, once again, we return to Gotham. Not the Gotham of sirens and shouting headlines. Not the Gotham of sudden explosions, frantic pursuits, or bright television screens. But the quieter Gotham. The Gotham that breathes beneath the rain. The Gotham that waits beneath old stone bridges, behind dark windows, and under clouds too heavy to move quickly. A city of rooftops and secrets, where lights burn late, shadows stretch long, and somewhere above it all, a single figure watches patiently from the gargoyles. So settle in now. Let the day grow distant. Allow the noise around you to fade, just a little at a time. In tonight's collection, the Dark Knight moves through older mysteries, strange lamps beneath forgotten streets, a clock tower that wakes the sleeping, a greenhouse alive in winter, a ferry that glides through the fog without docking, a cathedral that sings to the forgotten dead, and finally, a hidden room inside Wayne Manor itself. These are not tales of panic. They are slow stories, rain-soaked stories, stories carried by stone, fog, memory, and the soft turning of gears. So close your eyes if you'd like. Take a slow breath and let Gotham open again. Part 1. The lamps beneath old Gotham rain had been falling over Gotham since late afternoon. Not the violent kind that lashed at windows and flooded the gutters, but the patient sort. Steady, grey, unhurried. It softened the edges of buildings and turned the city lights into long streaks of amber and white. From high above Park Row, Batman stood motionless on a stone ledge, his cape moving only slightly in the cool wind. Below him, traffic whispered over wet pavement. A train somewhere to the east gave off a muted metallic groan as it passed over elevated tracks. Steam rose from a vent near the corner, vanishing almost as soon as it appeared. Gotham, in rain like this, seemed older. Its surfaces darkened, its sounds drew inward. It became less like a city built of concrete and glass, and more like something older still, something layered, hidden, listening. Batman touched the side of his cowl as Gordon's voice crackled quietly through the comm. "There's something odd under the Bowery blocks," Gordon said. "I know that doesn't narrow it down much." Batman remained silent for a beat, waiting. Gordon continued. "City workers found lights. Old ones, not electrical. Actual flame lamps, according to the first report. But there's no gas line, no modern wiring, nothing active in those tunnels. Maintenance says the section should be dead." "Any sign of occupation?" Batman asked. "Not obvious. No encampment. No recent construction permits. No break-in points. A taxi driver claimed he saw a warm light shining through a storm drain last night. We sent people to check. By the time they got there, nothing." Batman looked toward the oldest part of Gotham, where blocks had been rebuilt so many times that no one could say with confidence what remained beneath them. Streets layered over older streets. Foundations set upon older foundations. Forgotten rooms sealed behind newer walls. "I'm on my way," he said. The entrance was hidden inside a narrow service alley between two buildings whose brick facades had outlasted several city administrations. Water ran in thin lines along the mortar. Batman lifted a heavy iron grate that covered a maintenance shaft and descended into darkness. The air changed almost immediately. Above ground, Gotham smelled of rain, gasoline, distant food carts, and overheated cables. Down here, there was only dry stone, iron, and something faintly warm, like dust in a room that had just been opened after years of being sealed. His boots touched an old service platform. The beam of his light cut forward across rough walls, old drainage channels, and the rusted edges of abandoned municipal piping. There were signs this shaft had once connected to a larger system, but no modern crew had passed through here in a long time. Then he saw it. A lamp. It stood at the far end of the tunnel, set neatly on a stone shelf, as though placed there with care. Its glass chimney glowed gold. Its flame was steady and silent. No flicker, no smoke, just warm, impossible light. Batman approached slowly. The metal looked old. Older than any practical lamp should still be in active use. The oil reservoir was full, the wick trimmed. There were no fingerprints he could identify immediately, no recent scuff marks around it. And yet it had not been here long enough to gather the dust that coated everything else. He turned off his flashlight. For a moment, he stood in complete stillness, illuminated only by the lamp's soft amber glow. The tunnel around him ceased to feel industrial. It felt older, intentional, like a corridor in some buried estate. A second light appeared farther ahead, then a third. One by one, lamps glowed to life deeper within the passage, not all at once, but in sequence, as though something unseen were walking ahead and lighting the path for him. Alfred's voice came over comms, measured and calm as ever. I take it your silence means the reports were not exaggerated, sir. They were not, Batman said quietly. Charming. Batman moved deeper. The tunnel widened gradually into a low stone corridor, braced by old arches. These were no longer city maintenance walls. The masonry was older, finer, and strangely elegant beneath the grime. Alfred, working remotely from the Bat computer, began comparing fragments of architectural detail from Batman's scans to old city records. These support curves are unusual, Alfred said after a time. Not municipal, private built perhaps, late 19th century, possibly earlier if reused materials were involved. From whom? I'm narrowing the field. Gotham's oldest families were not known for modesty beneath the surface any more than above it. Batman passed through a chamber lined with empty shelves and collapsed crates. Another lamp waited on a narrow ledge, already lit. Then another. None behind him illuminated, only ahead. He stopped in the center of a four-way intersection of tunnels. The silence there was profound. Not empty, not dead, just watchful. Every small sound seemed absorbed by the stone rather than echoed back. Somewhere above, many feet of earth and city separated him from the rain. Down here, time had another texture. Slower, denser. Oracle joined the channel from the clock tower. I found something, she said. Old land records. Before several of these blocks became public works zones, parts of the underground were privately connected to foundations tied to three major families. One of them helped fund an informal security society around Gotham's commercial district. No official charter, very secretive. Batman listened. Oracle continued. Their correspondence uses an odd phrase repeatedly to maintain the necessary darkness. Batman looked at the next lamp. Meaning? No idea yet. But they seemed to think Gotham functioned best when certain things remained hidden. They used old court basements, private tunnels, storage chambers, maybe even observation rooms. He followed the right-hand passage. The walls narrowed again before opening into a larger room. Here, the dust was thinner. On one side stood an iron chair bolted to the stone floor, its design severe and simple. Beside it, a wooden desk leaned slightly under the weight of age. Papers had long since decayed to brittle fragments, but the room's arrangement suggested use, not storage. Someone had worked here, waited here, watched from here. Above the desk was a map of Gotham beneath Gotham, an underground rendering, hand-drawn in faded ink. Tunnels, vaults, sealed corridors, old wells, forgotten foundations. Some passages ended abruptly at X marks or warning symbols. Others continued deeper than any present city archive acknowledged. Batman photographed everything. Another lamp lit farther beyond the room. He moved on. At last the passage ended at an iron door, heavily rusted but no longer fully sealed. The frame had been disturbed recently. Not broken, just coaxed open with patient effort. Batman placed one gloved hand against the metal and pushed. The room beyond was circular. Shelves curved around its walls. Cabinets lined the perimeter. In the center stood a long table with ledgers stacked in neat rows, each wrapped in oilcloth. Someone had preserved them. Batman opened the first. Inside were names, dates, property holdings, quiet payments, notes on magistrates, ward bosses, dock unions, judges and contractors. Not criminal transactions in the usual sense. Not extortion, not smuggling, something subtler. The shaping of Gotham through silence, selective neglect, and carefully arranged decay. The Society Oracle had found was real. It had not ruled Gotham exactly. It had curated it, maintained pressure in some neighborhoods, relief in others, encouraged certain stories to disappear, ensured some streets remained dim, some tunnels forgotten, some institutions conveniently underfunded. They believed disorder in measured doses kept more dangerous powers from rising all at once. A philosophy of managed darkness. Batman turned another page, then another. At the back of the final ledger was a newer note, written in a different hand. Only a few lines. The lamps are to be lit again when memory fails. If the city forgets what holds it together, let it be guided downward. There are truths beneath the streets that daylight has never deserved. Batman closed the book slowly. He stood there for several long moments, while the lamp flames around the room burned in steady silence. Who had lit them again? A descendant? A historian? A conspirator trying to revive the old idea? Or someone who feared Gotham's newer forms of corruption had become even more dangerous than the old, carefully managed shadows? He searched the room thoroughly. At last he found the only recent sign of a visitor, a ceramic cup near the far cabinet, still carrying the faint dry scent of tea leaves. And beside it, a matchbox from a hotel that had closed 23 years ago. A deliberate anachronism. Or someone who lived among old things so long, the decades had stopped sorting themselves cleanly. By the time Batman returned to the surface, dawn was still far away. Rain met him again as he emerged into the alley. Cooler now than before, carrying the smell of rooftops and wet asphalt. He paused before replacing the grate. Behind him, in the darkness below, all lamps had gone out. All but one, he turned once more and looked down. Far at the edge of sight, in a passage he had not entered, a final golden flame burned steadily in the dark, as if someone deeper below had chosen not to hide. Then even that light vanished. Batman sealed the grate and stepped back into Gotham, where the rain kept falling and the city, above its own buried memory, carried on as though nothing beneath it had stirred at all. And as the night moved on, and the rain stretched thin over towers and wire lines, Gotham settled into that other kind of darkness, the kind not made by the absence of light, but by the weight of old things returning quietly to thought. Far above the streets, clocks marked the passing hours. But in Gotham, time was never merely what appeared on a face. Sometimes it pooled. Sometimes it repeated. Sometimes in the right tower at the wrong hour, it reached into sleep itself. Part 2. The Sleepless Clocktower. On the east side of Gotham, where older districts leaned toward the river and rooftops grew more uneven, there stood a clock tower that no longer kept faithful time. Its stone was stained black in places by a century of weather. Copper trim had gone green. Several windows near the upper levels were boarded from the inside, and ivy climbed one face of the tower, as though it had forgotten that buildings were not meant to be swallowed. The large clock itself still worked on certain days, and not on others. Sometimes both hands stopped at noon. Sometimes the minute hand lurched ahead after midnight, as if trying to catch up. Most Gotham residents ignored it. Like many things in the city, it had become part of the background simply by enduring long enough. But over the last 2 weeks, people in the surrounding neighborhood had begun waking at exactly 3:17 a.m. Not from noise, not from dreams they could remember. Just sudden waking. A woman in an apartment across the avenue described the sensation as a quiet internal jolt, as though someone had lightly tapped her shoulder from inside the room. A retired teacher said he always woke with the distinct impression of distant turning gears. A delivery driver, embarrassed by his own report, admitted he rose from bed each time already convinced he had overslept something important, though no alarm had rung. At 3:17, every time, Batman arrived just before 1 in the morning. He entered by grappling to the highest accessible parapet and slipping through a maintenance hatch whose lock had surrendered decades ago. Inside, the tower smelled of old wood, machine oil, dust, and damp paper. Wind moved faintly through cracks in the stone. Stairs spiraled up and down through the structure, narrow and worn in the middle, by the feet of generations. His light passed over shelves stacked with toolboxes, clock faces, replacement gears, and crates of parts tagged in handwriting, so neat it seemed almost ceremonial. Then he noticed the clocks. They were everywhere. Wall clocks hung in rows from crossbeams. Mantel clocks sat on work tables beneath cloth covers. Pocket watches lay open on velvet pads as though prepared for surgery. Schoolhouse clocks, railway clocks, kitchen clocks, brass travel clocks, tiny enamel clocks hardly larger than a hand mirror. Some worked, some did not. Some ticked so softly he only registered the sound when he stopped moving entirely. Batman reached a room beneath the main clock face, where several lamps had been recently maintained. On the central table sat a ledger, cataloguing every clock in the building by origin, damage type, and date of acquisition. Most had come from ordinary places. Homes, stations, church offices, corner stores. Then a pattern emerged. Some had been collected from scenes of loss. A tenement fire, a train platform accident, a courthouse collapse, a theatre balcony failure, an alley shooting. Not every tragedy in Gotham, but enough to stand out. Oracle's voice came in low through comms. I found the tower's last long-term keeper. Name was Jonah Vale. Died years ago, but there's more. He had a private theory, never published outside personal notes. Thought damaged clocks retained emotional resonance from the moments around them. Batman glanced toward a cracked wall clock whose minute hand was bent inward. He believed grief could remain in objects. More or less. He repaired them as a form of quieting. That was his word. Not restoration, quieting. Batman moved toward the mechanism chamber. The great gears of the tower rose through multiple levels, iron teeth meshing with careful, ancient force. Thick chains hung in loops. Weights descended through narrow channels. Everything should have been louder. But instead, the machinery gave off a deep, cushioned turning sound, as if decades of dust and deliberate maintenance had softened its voice. At 2:43 a.m., Batman found evidence of a recent installation hidden behind a gear housing. A compact resonance device mounted with elegant precision. Not crude, not improvised. It was designed to generate subtle vibrations along the tower's frame, translating motion into a low-frequency pulse that could spread through surrounding masonry and air. Not quite sound, more like a pressure pattern. He examined the calibration array. Timed release, controlled pulse window, repeating every 24 hours at 3:17. So that was how the waking happened. But why? Batman remained hidden in the mechanism chamber and waited. At exactly 3:17, the device activated. The effect was almost imperceptible at first. A shift in the tower's inner hum. A tightening in the air, as though the stone itself had inhaled. Then the clocks throughout the tower began ticking together. Not identically, but in sympathy. Hundreds of small mechanical hearts awakening in near unison. Tick, tick, tick. A vast, soft chorus of time. Below, through the cracked window openings, Gotham remained dark and still. Batman muted the device. The synchronized ticking continued for several seconds, before drifting apart again into separate rhythms. He disabled the unit fully and searched the rest of the tower. Near dawn, he found the designer. Not an assassin, not a saboteur, a restorer. She was an elderly acoustics engineer living in a neighboring building, once hired on a preservation project for the tower years earlier. After the city abandoned the restoration, she had continued visiting in secret. Her brother had been among those killed in a crowd disaster decades ago beneath the very clock tower, when a public evacuation signal had malfunctioned during a blackout. Since then, she had become quietly obsessed with the idea that cities remembered panic in their structures. If grief could cling to clocks, she reasoned, perhaps unease could settle in whole districts. And if so, perhaps one could awaken it, study it, and one day cure it. Her method had crossed a line. She had not wished to harm anyone. she wanted only to rouse buried anxiety gently enough to map its spread. She believed Gotham lived in a permanent half-sleep made of unresolved dread, and she had tried to measure it through the tower. Batman did not argue with her theory, only with her method. By the time morning light grayed the river, the resonance device had been removed. The clocks remained. Batman left them untouched. Before departing, he climbed into the bell chamber. The bell above him was cracked and would never ring properly again. Pigeons shifted in the beams. A pale slice of dawn showed between moving clouds. He stepped to the face of the clock. Its hands were wrong by nearly 17 minutes. With careful pressure on the service wheel, he reset them. Minute by minute, he guided the old mechanism back into alignment until the tower finally showed the hour it had actually become. Below, Gotham would soon wake for ordinary reasons: kettles, buses, alarms, the first trains. And that night, for the first time in many days, the neighborhood around the tower slept past 3:17. The clocks went on ticking, not in chorus now, just in patience. When the clocks were quiet again, winter seemed to deepen. The air over Gotham sharpened, rooftops silvered at dawn, windows held the cold longer, parks emptied earlier, and even the stray cats moved with a certain economy, choosing warmer ledges and avoiding open wind. Yet, in one forgotten place above the city, something green continued to grow. Not in defiance, not in spectacle, but quietly, as though life itself had found a hidden room in Gotham and decided, against all evidence, to remain. Part 3. The Man in the Winter Greenhouse. The old Botanical Institute sat behind iron fencing on a rise above one of Gotham's quieter avenues. Once, long ago, its glass structures had drawn families, school groups, and amateur gardeners from across the city. There had been lecture halls, specimen rooms, tropical collections, and a celebrated winter garden where people strolled beneath palms while snow fell beyond the panes. Now the buildings stood mostly abandoned. The main hall's stone steps were cracked. Ivy had claimed sections of the outer wall. Several side structures had lost entire bands of glass, their skeletal frames exposed to weather and time. And still, in the coldest part of the year, one greenhouse remained alive. A groundskeeper had seen a lantern moving inside at dusk. A delivery cyclist, taking a shortcut along the perimeter path, claimed warm air had drifted through the broken glass, smelling of wet earth and basil. Two teenagers, daring each other to look through a shattered panel, reported rows of living plants where no heating system should have remained functional. Batman arrived after midnight. Snow had not fallen, but frost coated the railings and dead hedges, turning them pale beneath the moonlight. His boots made almost no sound on the frozen path. Above him, the greenhouse stood at the edge of the property like a dark lantern, dimly glowing, patched with shadows where panels had broken or been boarded years before. Even from outside, he could feel the warmth leaking from within. He entered through a side opening where two panes had long ago been replaced by warped plywood. At once, the air changed. Moisture touched the inside of his cowl. The smell was rich and immediate. Soil, moss, leaves, old wood, faint citrus, stagnant irrigation lines, and something floral so subdued it seemed more remembered than sensed. The greenhouse was larger than it appeared from outside. Broken glass panels overhead had been covered in places with transparent sheeting, carefully stretched and weighted. Stone paths had been cleared through dense growth. Vines climbed old iron ribs. Ferns spread beneath benches. Large ceramic planters sat along the walls, each labelled in precise handwriting. Winter herbs grew in one section, shade-loving plants in another. A corner once dedicated to educational displays now held dozens of trays of seedlings under improvised reflective panels. It did not feel wild, it felt cared for. Batman moved slowly between the rows. There were no signs of chemical weapons, no obvious toxins, no controlled release systems hidden beneath the irrigation basins. Alfred, reviewing live scan data, noted no known volatile signatures associated with Pamela Isley. "Then it isn't her," Batman said. "Not likely in the theatrical sense, sir," Alfred replied. "Though I suspect Miss Isley would object to our discussing horticultural identity as though it were a handwriting sample." Batman passed a long wooden table covered in journals, seed packets, maps, and glass jars filled with soil. The labels on the jars drew his eye. Crime Alley, Burnside Rooftop Garden, Robinson Park North Fence Line, The Narrows, Canal Edge, Bristol Municipal Median, Wayne Grounds, East Wall, soil samples from all over Gotham. He opened one of the journals. The handwriting was fine, observant, almost reverential. South District vines show unusual resilience near damaged brick. Rosemary from Old Churchyard recovers faster when transplanted beside stone. Plants from neglected places conserve differently. Thicker roots, slower bloom, more patient recovery. Violence changes the soil, but not always by poisoning it. Sometimes it starves it of witness. Batman read in silence. Another entry. The city believes only in damage. It does not understand that life records atmosphere too. Oracle searched the Institute archives and came back with a name. Elias Thorne, botanist, worked here before the closures. Specialized in urban plant stress adaptation. Public reputation, eccentric. Private reputation, more eccentric. Claimed Gotham's flora responded not only to pollution and climate, but to emotional environments. Meaning, he believed grief, neglect, and chronic fear altered human treatment patterns, enough to shape ecosystems in distinct ways. People water certain places, abandon others, trim some sidewalks, ignore others. He thought the city's mood eventually becomes botanical. Batman looked around the greenhouse again. Nothing here contradicted that. At the far end, near a section of tall winter jasmine, stood the lantern the groundskeeper had described. It rested beside a wooden chair, and a small cast-iron stove connected to an improvised vent line. On the chair lay a folded blanket. Nearby, a teacup still held a shallow film of cooled liquid. Someone had been here recently. Maybe still was. Batman followed the sound of water into a narrower rear annex. The roof there was lower, patched in many places, and the glass more opaque with age. Beneath hanging baskets and trellised vines, he found a secondary chamber, warmed by black-painted water barrels that stored daytime heat. In the center stood a narrow cot and a desk. Pinned to the wall was a map of Gotham, marked not by crimes, utility lines, or property zones, but by plant survival patterns. Green circles, yellow circles, red notations, side comments, bloom records, seed dispersal, recovery timelines after fires and demolitions. This was not a criminal lair. It was a life's work. A door creaked softly behind him. Batman turned. An old man stood in the threshold holding another lantern. He was thin, stooped slightly, dressed in layers of worn wool and canvas, with soil under his nails, and a face weathered by equal parts age and weather. He did not appear surprised to see Batman, only tired. "You came quietly," the man said. Batman remained still. "Elias Thorne?" The old man inclined his head. "You've been living here." "Staying," Thorne corrected gently. "Living sounds too settled." "Why hide?" Thorne looked around the greenhouse before answering. "Because the city closes, what does not earn immediate return. Because broken places that heal slowly are inconvenient to budgets. Because once the Institute lost public funding, no one wished to hear lectures about neglected moss, grieving roots, or the emotional geometry of tree growth near violence." Batman said nothing. Thorne set the lantern down on the table. "You expected poison, or seduction, or revenge, perhaps. Gotham likes its plant stories dramatic. You took soil samples from across the city." "Yes." "To do what?" "To listen." Thorne smiled faintly, not unkindly. "Not with ears, obviously. With time." He moved carefully to one of the benches and touched a row of seedlings. Plants do not lie. They do not flatter. They do not reframe. If a place is starved, they show it. If it is loved, they show that too. I have spent years watching Gotham attempt to recover where no one thought recovery worth noticing. Batman's gaze lingered on the journal pages. "And the lantern?" "A practical object," said Thorne. "Though I admit it may have become symbolic through repetition." For a long while, neither of them spoke. Warm air drifted upward into the dark girders. Water clicked softly in an old radiator pipe. Somewhere beyond the greenhouse, a branch tapped the outer frame in the night wind. At last, Batman asked, "Why take soil from Wayne Manor?" Thorne gave a thoughtful nod. "Old estates tell on their owners. The east wall soil is exhausted from shade and restraint, but near the lower gardens there is stronger renewal than one might expect. Someone keeps planting against old habits there." Batman thought of Alfred. He thought of neglected corners gradually maintained back into dignity. Thorne seemed to read the direction of his silence. Cities heal unevenly, families too. By dawn, Batman had learned more. Thorne was not entirely alone. A former student occasionally smuggled in supplies. He sold nothing, distributed nothing, harmed no one. He had simply vanished from the official city grid and continued his work where the city had abandoned it. Batman did not expose him. Not fully. He arranged through quiet means and anonymous channels for the Greenhouse Property Review file to be flagged for historical preservation assessment rather than demolition. He redirected certain maintenance orders away from the structure. He left without promising Thorne anything aloud. Outside, the frost seemed sharper after the warmth inside. Batman stood once on the path and looked back. Through broken panels and patched glass, The greenhouse glowed softly in the winter dark like a pulse the city had failed to notice. Then he disappeared into the sleeping grounds, while behind him, leaves continued breathing in the warmth, patient as ever, beneath Gotham's long, cold season. Winter in Gotham did not end all at once. It loosened. A little less frost on the parapets. A little more movement in the harbour. Fog drifting lower over black water instead of freezing hard at the edges. And where there is harbour fog in Gotham, there are always stories. Stories of horn calls, of vanished routes, of lights seen where no vessel should be, of crossings half remembered and never fully explained. One of those stories returned to the bay after midnight, and Batman followed it out over the water. Part 4. The Ferry That Never Docked. The harbour was nearly invisible in fog. From the air, Gotham's shoreline looked like a series of smudged lanterns interrupted by dark piers and silent cranes. Water reflected almost nothing. It absorbed light more than it returned it, turning the bay into a slow black field where only the nearest edges of docks could be trusted. Batman crossed above it in the Batwing first, scanning the usual shipping lanes. Then descended to a lower pass when the first report came through Harbour Patrol. "Visual contact," said the dispatcher. "Old passenger ferry, west of the disused municipal line. Lights active, no transponder." A patrol boat had already tried to approach, but by the time it reached the last marked position, there was only fog and water. Batman left the aircraft on autopilot and continued by grapple and line from the service cranes near the old ferry terminal. From a high skeletal gantry, he waited almost perfectly still, while mist moved beneath him in layered sheets. Then he saw it. Not all at once. First the glow, soft rectangles of yellow through the fog, hovering where no building stood. Then the shape itself emerged. A ferry, long and pale, moving at a steady, deliberate pace. Its hull was older in design than anything still in city use. Cabin lights burned warmly behind misted windows. Exterior railings shone wet. No horn sounded. No engine growl carried over the water. Only the displaced hush of its passage through the bay. It moved like memory. Batman dropped. His boots touched the roof of the upper deck without sound. The surface was damp and cold beneath him. He crouched low and listened. No voices, no running engines, no radio chatter. Only the quiet slide of the vessel through dark water. He descended to the rear deck. The ferry's paint was faded but cared for. Rust had been sanded and sealed in places. Brass fixtures had been polished. A line of life rings hung neatly spaced along the wall. The windows were clear, not derelict, not abandoned. Inside, the passenger cabin glowed amber under old overhead fixtures. Rows of seats stood in patient order. The floor was dry. The air smelled faintly of salt, varnish, machine grease, and old upholstery. A timetable placard near the entrance bore dates from decades ago. On a side table rested a stack of paper tickets stamped in dark blue ink, each one clipped cleanly as though waiting for commuters who had not yet arrived. Batman walked the aisle. On one seat sat a folded newspaper, brittle with age but carefully preserved under clear wrapping. On another, a pair of gloves. Farther down, a child's red scarf, a thermos, a lunch tin, not random objects, belongings, preserved absences. Oracle searched archival maritime records while Batman moved into the lower lounge. "I found a likely match," she said. "Municipal Ferry Line 72. Disappeared during a winter blackout more than 30 years ago. Heavy fog, communications failures, conflicting witness reports. Officially presumed sunk, though wreckage was never conclusively identified." Batman glanced at the wheelhouse stairs. Passengers, 31 aboard, crew of 4. And no closure. Not really. Batman entered the wheelhouse. The controls were partly original, partly replaced. Navigation instruments old but functional. Compass restored, throttle assembly inactive. A modern guidance interface, discreetly mounted beneath the console, had been installed much later by someone skilled enough to blend eras without making it obvious. So the ferry was not supernatural. Not entirely, at least. It had been rebuilt, revived, sent back out. He traced the route on the map clipped beneath the glass cover. The vessel was repeating a path, not a practical transit line, but the most likely final route of the missing ferry on the night it vanished. Again and again, a reconstructed crossing. Batman followed the wiring to a hidden compartment containing remote navigation controls and a carefully maintained electric drive retrofit. Silent running, limited range, enough for the bay. Someone was reenacting the disappearance. He stayed aboard until the ferry reached the middle of its route, where fog thickened so fully that Gotham vanished in every direction. Here the vessel slowed. For a moment, it seemed to drift. The stillness was immense. No skyline, no shore, just lighted windows adrift in grey-black silence. Then a soft click sounded behind him. Batman turned. A speaker mounted near the helm had activated, static whispered. Then an old recorded voice emerged, faint, formal, weathered by time. "Municipal Line 72, east approach delayed by visibility conditions. Passengers are advised to remain calm." A pause, then another voice, perhaps from a separate recording. "We should already see the pier." Silence again, then static. Batman listened without moving. He understood now that the ferry had been turned into something between memorial and ritual. Not a thrill, not a hoax for attention, something quieter. When the vessel completed its circuit, Batman tracked the remote guidance signal inland to a narrow boathouse near an abandoned terminal lot. There he found the operator, an elderly man named Martin Sloan, son of one of the missing passengers. Sloan had spent years gathering scraps, maintenance drawings, retired engines, salvage parts, route records, witness statements, weather maps. He had rebuilt the ferry not exactly as it was, but as he imagined it in its final intact form. He ran the route on foggy nights because, in his words, the city never held still long enough to remember. His mother's body had never been found. No official explanation had ever satisfied him. Over the years, public memory thinned. Offices closed, records scattered. The story dissolved into one more unresolved Gotham loss. So he rebuilt the crossing, not to summon ghosts, to refuse forgetting. Batman did not approve of the harbor risk, nor the secrecy, nor the manipulation of patrol resources. Yet he understood the shape of the grief behind it. He arranged with Gordon for the vessel to be quietly seized, not destroyed. He saw to it that the preserved items aboard were catalogued respectfully. He provided, through channels no one traced back to Wayne, support for a formal memorial exhibit at the Harbour Museum. The next night, no ferry emerged from the fog. Only the harbour itself remained, breathing slowly beneath shifting mist. Batman stood once on the old terminal roof before leaving. The rails were wet. The water below turned with the tide in slow, dark folds. Somewhere far out in the bay, a buoy bell rang once and then again. And for a moment, in the distance, he thought he saw one pale rectangle of light moving across the fog. But when he looked again, there was only water. Harbours remember differently than churches do. Water keeps loss in motion. Stone holds it still. And in Gotham, there were places built not only to gather the living, but to contain echoes long after voices had gone. Old cathedrals, old courts, old theatres, buildings whose interiors seemed larger at night than their outer walls could possibly allow. In one such place, beneath cracked glass and moonlit arches, Gotham began to sing again. Not loudly, not for crowds, but for names the city had nearly allowed to disappear. Part 5. The Choir in Blackstone Cathedral. Blackstone Cathedral rose from its block like a weathered ship of stone. Even by Gotham standards, it felt old. Older than the district around it. Older than the street lamps outside its gates. Older than the patched stretches of sidewalk that ringed it. Generations had repaired it, neglected it, reopened it, abandoned parts of it, restored sections, then run out of money and left scaffolding standing for months at a time. Its history was not cleanly kept. It was layered, scarred, and still somehow dignified. Batman arrived just after midnight. A pale moon lay behind thin cloud, and what light reached the cathedral filtered through incomplete stained glass, broken tracery, and dust gathered high in the arches. The great main doors were locked, but Batman entered through an upper clerestory opening where restoration crews had left temporary access rigging. He landed soundlessly on a beam above the nave. Below him stretched rows of pews washed in dim blue-grey light. Stone columns rose like tree trunks into darkness. The air smelled of old incense, coal dust, candle wax, damp mortar, and winter air slipping in through imperfect seams. Then he heard it. Singing, soft at first. Not one voice, but many, layered, measured. Not a performance for audience, but a hymn-like current moving through the cathedral's interior spaces. The notes rose, held, drifted through the vaulting, then settled back into the stone. Batman remained still, listening. The sound did not come from one place. It seemed to originate from several directions at once. Rear chapel, transept corridor, perhaps even below the floor. Not amplified in any obvious modern way. It had a human texture. Breath, fragility, minor imperfections that made it real. Robin, patched into comms from the cave, whispered, "You seeing anyone?" "No." Speakers, not active. Batman descended through the shadow of a column and crossed the nave. The singing continued. Soprano lines rose, then disappeared beneath lower sustained voices. The acoustics of the cathedral stretched every phrase, until the building seemed to keep singing even between breaths. It was solemn music, but not mournful in the theatrical sense. It felt deliberate, attentive, like a hand laid gently over a wound, not to dramatize it, but to acknowledge its existence. Near the altar he found no performers, no recent footprints in the dust-heavy center aisle either. Restoration tarps covered side scaffolds. Organ pipes loomed high above, many damaged beyond use. Yet the sound remained. Batman moved toward a stairwell leading down to the crypt level. There, he found the first clue. Candle wax pooled recently on a stone shelf. Nearby lay folded paper programs, not printed professionally, typed and copied on old stock paper. Each bore a date and a short title. For those not named in the papers. For the winter missing. For the third shift dead. Batman unfolded one. Inside was a list of names, not famous names, not public tragedies preserved in Gotham memory through repetition. These were quieter dead, night janitors, crossing guards, a kitchen porter stabbed during a robbery, a woman struck by debris during a downtown collapse, 2 brothers lost in a tenement fire, a nurse caught in crossfire while walking home after a late shift. Ordinary citizens the city had not held onto for long. Another sheet, more names, another still more. Oracle searched church staffing and historical choir records. Possible match, she said after a while. Marion Voss, former assistant choir director. Family losses over several decades tied to unrelated Gotham crimes. She left formal church work years ago, but never cut contact completely. Batman followed a side corridor beneath the transept and found a room lined with resonance chambers, architectural spaces designed long ago to soften and redistribute sound through the cathedral. Several had been reopened during restoration, though not fully documented. Hidden among them were small recording units, some active, some archival, all configured to blend old choir recordings with live input from remote chapel spaces. So part of the sound was preserved, part of it was present. A ritual stitched through stone acoustics. He found Marion Voss at last in a side chapel lit by one shaded lamp. She stood before a small lectern, conductor's hands raised, her face lined by age and tiredness, but utterly steady. Hidden behind a grill in the adjoining chamber were 3 singers, volunteers, older themselves, dressed in simple dark coats, following her almost invisible gestures. Around them, carefully timed playback from old choir reels filled the cathedral with harmonies larger than their number. Marion did not startle when Batman stepped into the threshold. She lowered her hands gradually, allowing the final sustained chord to thin into silence. For several moments, neither spoke. At last she said, "You listened before interrupting. Thank you." Batman's cape settled behind him as he stood in the dim side chapel. "You've been entering after hours." "The doors I use were never fully forgotten," she replied. "The city reported unauthorized access. The city reports many things and remembers few." Batman glanced at the stack of programs. The names. Marion looked down at them with a softness that made her seem briefly much younger and much older at once. Most people are mourned intensely and then practically. That is no insult. Life requires continuation. But some losses vanish too quickly from civic memory. Unless someone repeats the names, they are absorbed into statistics and weather reports. She moved slowly to a pew and sat. Her hands, though calmer now, still carried the after-image of conducting. "I used to train choirs to lift great sacred music into the rafters. Then Gotham took people from me in pieces. A brother, a cousin, 2 friends, parishioners, students. Others I never knew personally. only through the records no one revisited. At some point I began to feel the city itself had become impatient with grief, unless it was dramatic enough. Batman said nothing. He understood that impatience. News cycles, caseloads, endless forward motion. Marion continued. So, I made a place for slower remembering. Not to accuse, not to frighten, only to let their names inhabit stone for 1 hour each week. Batman looked up toward the dark vaulting overhead, imagining all the voices woven there. Old recordings, new breaths, sound guided through forgotten chambers. You hacked the restoration system. Improved it, she said with a slight trace of humor. Why hide? Because if I asked permission, it would become committee work, insurance work, compliance work, time slot work. By then, the living would again be too busy, and the dead too quiet. The singers behind the grill remained respectfully silent. Batman studied the chapel. No weapons, no extortion, no sabotage. Only careful, unauthorized remembrance. Still, there were risks. After-hours access, structural hazards, possible panic if the midnight singing spread into headlines as haunting or cult activity. He did not shut it down on the spot. Instead, he said, no more unsecured entrances, no use during active restoration shifts, and if you continue, it becomes official. Marion looked up sharply. Official things tend to get simplified. Not if I make certain they do not. She held his gaze for a long moment, reading the seriousness in it. Then she nodded. Before dawn, arrangements were already beginning in motion through quiet channels. A memorial music series, community remembrance nights, anonymous grants, restoration provisions for safe access. The city would think the idea had emerged from a foundation initiative combined with church preservation efforts. No one needed to know who nudged which paperwork into which hands. When Batman finally crossed the nave again, the cathedral was silent, but it was not empty. The names remained in the programs. The sound remained in the stone. Even after the last note had faded, the place held its shape of remembrance, like a vessel still warm from what it had contained. Outside, the night air felt colder. Batman paused at the cathedral steps and looked back once through the high-fractured windows. Moonlight and darkness shared the interior evenly now. No singing, only rest. Then he turned toward the city again, where grief waited in 1,000 buildings and alleys and apartments, asking not always to be solved, but at least not forgotten. And yet of all the places where Gotham kept its oldest truths, none were stranger than the homes of those who believed themselves separate from the city. Mansions on hills, generational estates, long corridors lined with portraits and polished wood. Rooms locked not for safety, but for silence. In the hours just before dawn, when old houses settle and memory moves easiest through walls, Wayne Manor revealed that it too had been keeping something hidden. Not beneath the city this time, not across the harbor, but inside the family itself. Part 6. The room behind Wayne Manor. Wayne Manor was quiet in ways Gotham never was. Not silent exactly. No old house of that size ever became truly silent. Timber expanded and contracted with temperature. Pipes whispered through walls. Floorboards held and released the memory of weight. Wind pressed against ancient windows and moved gently along corridors. At night, the manor seemed less asleep than contemplative. as though every room retained some awareness of the years it had outlived. Bruce knew its sounds. He had known them first as a child, afraid of the dark portions of the hallway. Later, as a teenager, wandering sleepless after grief. And later still, as a man who had mapped secret levels, reinforced caverns, and tactical exits beneath and beyond the official architecture. That was why the unfamiliar sound stood out. 3 mornings in a row, just before dawn, he heard a door close somewhere in the eastern wing. Softly, deliberately. Not a slammed draft, not a warped hinge complaining. A proper closing. The eastern wing had long been mostly unused. Renovation plans had stalled years ago after structural surveys revealed nothing urgent but too many hidden costs to prioritize. Alfred kept it dusted better than most abandoned places deserved, but few had reason to walk there regularly. On the 4th morning, Bruce rose before the sound could come. The manor was still dark. Alfred had not yet brought tea. Dawn remained an idea rather than a fact at the windows. Bruce moved without the cape at first, only in dark house clothes, silent through corridors panelled in old walnut and lined with portraits whose eyes never seemed accusatory, only patient. The eastern wing felt cooler. Its carpets muted his steps. Sheet-covered furniture stood like pale shapes in the dimness. Wall lamps remained off, leaving the corridor lit only by the faint pre-dawn grey slipping around heavy curtains. The air smelled of polished wood, old books, linen, and long inhabited stone. He reached the end of the main passage and stopped. There, a faint seam in the panelling near a built-in shelf. Not obvious, not recent, simply something he had never been shown and had never happened to notice. Bruce ran his fingers along the moulding. A hidden latch yielded under light pressure. The panel opened inward. Beyond it lay a narrow room built between walls. Not a servant's passage, not a utility void. A room, deliberate, concealed, but finished. Small desk, lamp, shelves, boxes, one narrow chair. No windows. The air inside was dry, undisturbed, and carrying the layered scent of paper and cedar. Bruce stood at the threshold for a long time before entering. The room did not feel threatening. It felt withheld. He switched on the small desk lamp. To his mild surprise, it still worked from a dedicated old circuit. Warm light spread across the desk and nearest shelves, leaving the upper corners in shadow. On the wall hung city maps, old Gotham maps. Not decorative reproductions, but working documents marked in pencil and ink. Shelter locations, clinic routes, courthouse jurisdictions, transit connections between poorer districts and medical facilities, marginal notes, questions, financial arrows. Certain blocks circled repeatedly where housing, policing, and hospital access overlapped in troubling ways. Bruce moved closer. The handwriting was his father's, not from memory alone. From records, signatures, or birthday cards, the annotations Thomas Wayne had once left in medical texts. There was no mistaking the controlled clarity of it. On the desk lay bundles of letters tied in ribbon, project notes, meeting summaries, and typed drafts with handwritten revisions. Several referred to charitable efforts Bruce had known about publicly. Hospital work, donor programs, neighborhood clinics. But deeper in the stack were private investigations Thomas had apparently undertaken outside any formal Wayne initiative. Bruce sat slowly in the chair. He began to read. Thomas Wayne, it seemed, had grown increasingly troubled in the years before his death by patterns the public never saw clearly. Funding, intended for certain neighborhoods, vanished through shell boards and subcontracting. Improvement bonds somehow bypassed the same vulnerable areas repeatedly. Small clinics closed in clusters after pressure from property interests. Magistrates delayed hearings that should have exposed procurement fraud tied to old Gotham families with polished public reputations. The room behind the wall had been Thomas's quiet workspace for these inquiries. Not because the study downstairs was inadequate, but because this work needed silence and privacy beyond even what public philanthropy allowed. Bruce opened another folder. There were names in it he recognized from more recent investigations underground. Families tied to old civic manipulation, quiet influence networks, foundations that liked to preserve their own version of order, the same shadows, decades apart. So, Thomas had seen pieces of it. Perhaps not the full machinery beneath Gotham, but enough to worry him. Bruce stood and moved to the shelves. More files, community maps, notes from trusted doctors, correspondence with legal contacts urging caution. One unsent letter drafted to a city paper editor, never mailed. Another to a judge. Another to a business associate, suggesting that the Wayne name had been too useful, too often, to people who treated charity as cover for selective control. There were also softer things in the room. A pressed flower inside one notebook. Martha's handwriting on a shopping list tucked between budget papers. A half-finished teacup ring on the desk blotter. Human traces that made the hidden work feel less like secret mythology and more like an evening habit interrupted by ordinary domestic life. A light knock sounded at the panel. Alfred. Bruce did not answer immediately. The panel opened a fraction, and Alfred looked in. He was composed as always, but not surprised. "You found it," Alfred said. Bruce turned toward him. "You knew?" "Yes, Master Bruce. For how long?" "Since before your parents passed." Bruce held Alfred's gaze. Not angry, not yet certain what emotion belonged there. "Why didn't you tell me?" Alfred stepped fully into the room, carrying a tray with tea, as though even discoveries buried in walls deserved proper service. He set it gently on a side shelf. "Because it was not mine to unveil before you were ready to see it as a room rather than a legend," he said. "And because after your parents died, the house had enough ghosts without adding another chamber of unfinished intentions." Bruce looked back at the maps. "You thought I'd romanticize it. I thought you might weaponize it against yourself," Alfred said softly. That landed with enough truth to keep Bruce silent. Alfred moved a hand lightly across the back of the chair. "Your father worked in here when he wished to think outside the pressure of boardrooms and headlines. He was trying to understand where Gotham's visible suffering connected to invisible design. He found evidence, enough to worry him, not enough to complete the matter." Bruce opened one final folder near the bottom of the desk drawer. Inside was a personal notebook. Thomas's reflections were less formal here. Questions, doubts, frustrations, guilt. He wrote of treating symptoms in patients while systems kept producing the same wounds. He wrote of wealth's blindness, including his own. He wrote of fearing that certain civic darknesses were not accidents at all, but arrangements preserved because they benefited people who called themselves responsible. And then one line Bruce read twice. If Bruce inherits anything of value, let it not be merely money or obligation. Let it be the refusal to accept that decay is natural when it is in fact curated. Bruce closed the notebook. For a long time, the only sound in the hidden room was the faint hiss of the lamp and the distant morning settling into the rest of the manor. Outside the wall, birds had begun cautiously in the gardens. Alfred poured tea, though neither of them drank immediately. Finally, Bruce asked, "Did my father know how dangerous it was?" Alfred considered. He knew enough. Whether he knew the scale of it, I cannot say. Bruce looked at the old city maps, then at the newer memories of tunnels, ledgers, lamps beneath Gotham. Threads connected. Not perfectly, not neatly, but enough. The hidden room was not simply an archive. It was an invitation forward, not to become Thomas Wayne, not to sanctify him. The papers made clear his imperfections, blind spots, hesitations, but they also revealed a version of the family history, not built only on tragedy and inheritance. There had been inquiry here, resistance, private attempts to push against curated decay. Morning finally touched the high hall windows outside the eastern wing, thinning the darkness in the corridor beyond the panel. Bruce gathered several folders to take below to the Batcave for deeper analysis. Others he left exactly where they were, at least for the moment. The room felt changed by being opened, but not emptied. At the threshold, he paused. He looked back at the lamp, the maps, the desk, the shelves, the accumulated patience of years hidden inside walls. So much of Gotham had always seemed to demand vigilance against what lurked outside. But now the past had offered something else. Not an enemy, a continuation. Bruce switched off the lamp. The room returned to shadow, but not to secrecy. This time he left the panel unlatched. And when he stepped back into the corridor of Wayne Manor, dawn had begun in earnest. Soft, pale, and quiet across the long eastern wing. As though the house itself had finally exhaled. And so, as morning slowly approached Gotham, the city remained what it had always been. Complicated, weathered, restless, layered with old grief, old stone, hidden rooms, and flickers of light that refused to go out completely. Below its streets, forgotten lamps had burned for memory. Inside its towers, clocks had turned softly through the night. In winter glass houses, green life had endured. Out in the harbour, fog had carried the shape of an unfinished crossing. Within cathedral walls, names had been sung back into stone. And behind the walls of Wayne Manor, the past had opened not as a wound alone, but as a door. Above all of it, Batman remained what Gotham most needed him to be in these quieter hours. Not only a guardian against violence, but a witness. A patient presence moving through darkness without rushing to fill every silence. A figure on rooftops, in tunnels, under arches, along frozen paths, beside old desks and older secrets. Listening, watching, remembering what others had almost let disappear. Now the night is nearly over. The rain has thinned. The fog has drifted outward over the bay. Somewhere, the first train is beginning its route. Somewhere else, A kettle is warming in an apartment kitchen high above a still dark street. And in the fading quiet before the day fully arrives, Gotham rests for just a moment. So let yourself rest too. Let the city grow distant now. Let the stone, the rain, the lamps, the soft ticking, the harbour mist, and the cathedral hush all drift away into the background. And if you return to Gotham another night, the rooftops will still be there, waiting, quiet as ever. Good night.